Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me in another episode where we explore German idealism, principally through the figures Immanuel Kant, Johann Fichte, and Friedrich Schelling. But before we can understand the philosophy of German idealism and the post-Kantians, we need to understand what the German idealists are responding to. The world of philosophy that German idealism is responding and reacting against is the world of the so-called new science, Enlightenment or modern philosophy, which can roughly be said to have begun with the publication of Sir Francis Bacon's Novum Organum, The New Science, in 1620. Tied to the new science is also the French philosopher René Descartes and his Meditations on First Philosophy. The two are brought together in the pursuit of the so-called modern project, the conquest of nature, begun by Bacon, and the attempt to understand the self, begun by Descartes, even though the quest for self-knowledge really began with the existential phenomenology of St. Augustine. Bacon was an English philosopher, scientist, and statesman who helped to establish the tradition of philosophy now known as empiricism. His was a philosophy of reductionist materialism that reduced the world to an instrumented object. This included subject beings, i.e. humans. Humans were nothing more than a material mass of atoms composed together in motion as everything else in the object world was. However, man had the unique ability to dominate, and according to Bacon, to advance our knowledge, man had to interrogate nature on the rack of investigation. Empirical science is the outcome of this instrumental exploitation of nature. It is not the axiom of this worldview. This also brings about the end of the science of vitalism, the pre-modern scientific worldview begun by the Greeks and inherited by Christianity through Neoplatonism, which argued that the world and all life forms therein had distinct and particular life forces, and, according to Christianity, intelligibility in them. Vitalism can be summed up as the outlook that living organisms are fundamentally different from non-living entities because they contain some non-physical element or are governed by different principles than are inanimate things. Through the rise of Bacon and the new science, this vitalism that distinguished living organisms from non-living organisms gets blurred. Living organisms are really the same as those inanimate things, those inanimate objects. In essence, Baconian science stripped man of his vitalism, his so-called life essence, and turned him into a material object of the world, ultimately no different than other objects in the world. We are familiar with this outlook today. Popular scientific intellectuals and premature philosophers like Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and even Daniel Dennett exhibit these views. Critics of this new science call this reductionist materialist worldview the nothing but outlook. Humans are nothing but atoms composed and hitting each other in a certain manner which gives the appearance of a human. Trees are nothing but atoms composed and hitting each other in a certain manner which give the appearance of a tree. A dog is nothing more but atoms composed and hitting each other in a certain manner which give the appearance of a dog, and so on. Man is reduced to an object in a world of objects, and all objects follow mechanical and mathematical laws of motion. Although Bacon was, properly, a monistic materialist, his sidestepping, or shall we say eradication, of consciousness produced a functional dualism, a dualism that pitted man against nature as the supreme object of force. Man could not dwell in nature. Man would simply overwhelm and destroy nature. The forces of science and industry would be unleashed by man's motionary movement to accomplish this task. On the opposite end of Bacon was the French rationalist René Descartes. Descartes is probably best remembered to posterity as the philosopher who proved human existence by saying, "I think, therefore I am," the famous cogito ergo sum. The task of Descartes' philosophy, Cartesian philosophy, or Cartesian rationalism, was to affirm the subject's own subjectivity. In other words, to affirm one's own existence. The problem that arises from Descartes' philosophy is the classical mind-body problem. Are humans a mind inhabiting a body, or a body with a mind? And this leads us to ask the question, what is the mind? Unwittingly, Descartes' dualism, so-called, ended up advancing the Baconian outlook. Man was a body, and his mind was nothing but matter. But this wasn't so much the problem with Descartes that the German idealists took. Later generations of Cartesian rationalists ended up becoming subjective solipsists. That is, I can only affirm my own existence. In a world where only the I think could prove its own existence, I am forever cut off from others. The others that I perceive to be existing may or may not actually be existing. I can never know because I do not have access to their minds. I can never think as another beside myself. Therefore, I can never affirm anyone's own existence besides my own. The end result is a detachment and flight from the material world and the world of others, the world of relationships. Admittedly, this is not what Descartes ever intended, but the tradition of philosophy spawned by his thought nevertheless exhausted into a solipsistic rationalism, where the self was forever awash in a sea of isolated and atomized minds and particles. It is this world of philosophy that German idealism, coming into form with Immanuel Kant, is reacting against. In this sense, German idealism is a reactionary philosophy. It is reacting against the new science. The task of Kantian idealism, or simply the task that Kant dwelled upon for nearly a decade and finally published his thoughts in the Critique of Pure Reason, was how to achieve or re-achieve the apperceptive unity of the I and not I, the I think with other I thinks, and with the phenomenal world of space and time without allowing subjects to become objectified and instrumentalized into conformity with the determinacy of mathematical laws, which would reduce subject beings into objects, and also keeping subjects detached from one another, as in the case of Cartesian philosophy. The I think, the thinking subject, must be able to accompany all representations it encounters and perceives, and this is what is called self-consciousness. Kant, then, revises the Cartesian and Baconian outlook by starting with the mind, like Descartes, but attaching the phenomenal world to the mind, unlike Bacon. Mind comes into existence with innate ideas. In this way, Kant is following Plato and can be said to be a revisionist Platonist. The categories of the mind are also lifted from Aristotle. So while the mind comes into existence with innate ideas, thus denying the tabula rasa, or the blank slate, of John Locke, an outlook now generally rejected by all except the most fervent defenders of the reductionist model of science, space and time, that phenomenal realm of experience and sensation, are also forms of a priori intuition that the mind projects. That is, mind, not body, is the seat of sensation and experience. It is wrong to deduce, as the reductionists do, that our bodily experiences and sensations are only tied to the body. Kant argues that they are really tied back to the mind, as sensational experiences are rooted in consciousness, in thought, in the mind's innate ideas, and so on. What we experience comes through mental faculties, and mental faculties are not reducible to a bland hunk of meat and atoms as the reductionist materialists claim. Plants, for instance, are material bodies with atoms, but plants do not have sensory experiences because they do not possess consciousness. Animals, which have material bodies and are also reducible to atoms, do feel because they have minds, but they are not self-conscious. That is, they are not rational in the classical sense. Reason, for Kant, is that which permits man to know his nature, to know and experience the transcendentals, the good, the true, and the beautiful. Animals, as far as we know, back in Kant's time and today, do not have this indwelling of reason, and therefore it prevents them from having a unitive relationship with the transcendentals and coming to understand nature, though they do, unlike, as Descartes argued, have the ability for basic sensory experiences, precisely because they have raw animal minds. The mind, according to Kant, cannot exist without this ability to project the phenomenal realm of objects which are, as stated, a projection of the mind. This brings us to the synthetic a priori in Kantian philosophy. As the mind comes into being with innate ideas, this means that our innate ideas, from Kant's perspective, can be confirmed in the world of phenomenon. The a priori is that which is known without experience. The a priori is that which is true by definition, like all bachelors are unmarried. One does not need to meet a bachelor to confirm this reality. It is an a priori, a definitional or logical truth. A posteriori is that which is known or confirmed by experience. One needs to have a direct experience to validate an a posteriori claim to knowledge. For example, John was planting a flower in the afternoon. This can only be known from experience, that I saw or encountered John planting a flower in the afternoon. If I do not have this direct experience, I cannot make a valid epistemological claim. It is cut off from me. Kant's synthetic a priori bridges the a priori and a posteriori worlds together. Again, because the phenomenal realm, the world of the a posteriori, is a projection of the mind, the world of a priori, which permits us to confirm a priori ideas, the synthetic a priori is the attempt to achieve that apperceptive unity of the rational world and the world of experience. The synthetic a priori, then, is where the world of phenomenon is linked to the world of thought. The synthetic a priori is where thought and experience meet, and where they meet that apperceptive unity that was lost in the world of Bacon by ultimately denying thought by objectifying everything, and lost by Descartes by only being able to confirm the a priori detached entirely from the phenomenal world. Kant believes he has solved or resolved the dilemma of contemporary philosophy, namely that separation of the phenomenal from the rational. But Kant's philosophical project begins with mind. It does not begin with the phenomenal world of objects or nature. Instead, the phenomenal world is a projection of our mind, as already stated, our thought, our consciousness. If I exist without thought, I am a pure object, but I would have no knowledge of my existence. A rock, for instance, has no knowledge of its existence because it does not possess consciousness. A rock exists because it simply exists as a projection of the human mind and its sensory experiences. Ergo, for Kant, existence and knowledge of existence has to be tied back to the mind. A rock has no comprehension of its own existence precisely because it has no mind. As such, we can dispense with the Baconian outlook that all things are objects. If true, we could never know our own existence. Of course, Kant also limited knowledge in his Critique of Pure Reason. The mind only has access to the phenomenal world. It does not have access to the thing in itself, the noumenal world. And this is where the split in post-Kantian idealism begins. Johann Fichte was a student of Kant's, and probably his most famous student in his time. Although little known in the English-speaking world, Fichte was one of the most important philosophers in the 1790s and early 1800s until his death. If English speakers have any awareness of Fichte, it is likely to be through his address to the German nation, given during the height of the Napoleonic Wars, which was part speech on the need for education and educational reform, as well as a call for German unity against the French occupiers. Fichte, apart from being a philosopher, a metaphysician, and epistemologist, was also a political philosopher and civil servant. His work of political economy, Der geschlossene Handelsstaat, led him to being an advisor to the Prussian Minister of Commerce in 1800. In fact, Fichte's address to the German nation is the logical derivative of his larger philosophical projects. Fichte considered himself a Kantian in spirit, as all the post-Kantian idealists did. That is, while they disagreed with the substance of Kant's limited metaphysic and epistemology, they nevertheless took up the project of defending mind, consciousness, reason, against its potential enemies, the materialists and the solipsists. In 1794, Fichte entered the world of philosophical dialectic with the publication of his Science of Knowledge. In the introduction, he laid out the two main schools in which all philosophies could be boxed into. One school he called the dogmatists. The other school he called the idealists. The dogmatists were those scientific materialists stretching as far back as the pre-Socratics to the materialists of today, now known as the empiricists. The dogmatists were those whom Fichte opposed, for these mechanical materialists were dogmatic in their insistence that all life and laws could be reduced to the determinacy of the laws of motion. According to Fichte, this reductive materialism moves us to an acceptance of determinism, which has sweeping implication, all in the negative in Fichte's mind, as it relates to ethical life. Fichte, in this sense, also wishes to actualize the Kantian ethical imperative. Fichte was, in a word, a moralist. He believed humans had duties and responsibilities to each other, to act in a Kantian manner, in a way in which we would wish our actions to become universalized throughout the world. Dogmatists, in reducing knowledge to properties of mechanical laws and motion, which ultimately deny free will and therefore responsibility, ultimately exhaust into amorality or, in Fichte's mind, immorality. For morality hinges upon responsibility, for ethics is not a singular solipsistic endeavor. Ethics involves the other. That means ethics involves relationships with others, which means ethics involves how we interact with others. From the dogmatic materialist point of view, a rape or a murder is nothing more than matter imposing itself on other matter. There is no way to derive any morality from the logic of reductionist materialism. And in fact, many of the reductionist materialists recognize this, which is why they reject, like Hume, the ultimate conclusion of their own philosophy. For Fichte, they are being inconsistent. The idealists, whom Fichte considered himself part of, would have included the likes of Plato, Plotinus, Augustine, the broader Christian tradition, and, most importantly, Kant. The idealists, Fichte claimed, were concerned with the question of perception. Today we call this school of thought phenomenology. From perception arises the concern for consciousness. From consciousness, self-consciousness. From self-consciousness, the subject. From the subject, other subjects as we come to recognize that other, those thinking subjects, persons, and we know that they exist, and from these encounters we begin to form moral responsibility to each other. Fichte's philosophy is grounded in the self, which he calls the ego. And the ego is desire, movement, energy, creativity, moving to moral joy, which is found in absolute knowledge, and absolute freedom, which is tied to responsibility. But we'll get back to this issue later. Fichte's break with Kant rested with Kant's assertion that the human mind was cut off from the thing in itself, the noumenal realm. According to Fichte, while this does provide a certain clear foundation for some knowledge, it nevertheless is insufficient to achieve what Kant had earlier set out to achieve, namely, to ward off the dangers of the mechanical philosophers. Accordingly, if objects, the thing in themselves, remain separate and unknown to us, the mechanical philosophers will seize this opening and maintain that the objects, those things in themselves, in the noumenal world, are in fact the cause of our sensations, and this once again reduces humans to objects, and it also destroys the possibility for any foundational morality. For if the mind cannot perceive or have experience of these things in themselves, this means we cannot be sure that everything exists and can be perceived through the mind, as Kant argued. Thus, Fichte is a true son of the Kantian tradition, which he always claimed. He wants to produce a philosophy of mind, which is the philosophy of ego, which is all-encompassing and all-knowing, which will prevent any crack and crevice for the mechanical materialists to exploit. Like Kant, Fichte is concerned with re-establishing a foundational philosophy for the apperceptive unity of the I and the not I, subject and object, to exist. Things as they are must ultimately be tied back into the self. Fichte's philosophy is therefore not only grounded in the self, it is grounded in the heroic self, the heroic ego which strives for encounter and conquest, to encounter and conquer the noumenal world, the world of others, the world of the not I, the world of objects and other egos different than that of my own. In this way, too, he hopes to resolve the Cartesian solipsistic dilemma, even though, in his own lifetime, Fichte was accused of being a solipsist. The charges that Fichte was a solipsist rest ultimately on unfamiliarity of the Christian psychological and ontological tradition which Fichte was himself somewhat unknowingly inheriting and building from. In the Christian tradition, humans are images of the Trinity. The Trinity is simultaneously pluralistic yet united, three in one: Father, memory; Son, intellect; and Spirit, love. Fichte's movement of ego to absolute ego, or I to absolute I, is the unity of the I with the not I, i.e., ego with other egos, and it follows this basic Christian framework. There must be a unitive link that binds egos together into the absolute, just as the three persons of the Trinity are bounded together by and through love. This binding together, according to Fichte, is absolute knowledge. I come to know you, that which I am not, the not I, through knowledge. This knowledge is achieved through encounter and engagement, which ultimately results in recognition of what the not I is. The ego, Fichte asserts, is moved by an insatiable quest or desire for knowing. Roland Kani and Dieter Heinrich, two contemporary scholars of German idealism, have written how Fichte inherits and builds upon Augustine's original insight of man, the se nocere and the se cogitar. Man thinks so as to come to know. His thinking is motivated by deep existential impulses and desires. Man is, as Spinoza said, in riffing from Augustine, a creature of desire. Thus, Augustine's will, which seeks after God, is now the Fichtean ego, seeking after the absolute, which is the temporalization of God in Fichte's philosophy. The ego encounters other egos, the not I, and in these encounters grow mutual recognition and understanding. It is in the phenomenal realm, the world of nature, that the I not I encounter develops. The social ego begins to emerge through these encounters of the I and not I to the point of the I and not I fusing together as one, to become one in absolute knowledge of each other, to form the absolute I. The ego's transformation to absolute ego, the I to absolute I, is by the I's conquest of the unknown. That engagement, encounter, and recognizing the unknown, the noumenal or the not I, leads to its absorption into the self. Self-knowledge is only possible through this coming to understand of the totality of the whole. Fichte's epistemology of the heroic ego is like the adventurous traveler, who is the ego, climbing, indeed struggling, up the mountain to get to the top of the peak to look over the vast horizon of wholeness. Only in completing this journey does the ego absorb all, understand all, and becomes one with totality. At the mountaintop, the ego is transformed into the absolute ego, which has broken down the barrier of the unknown, and that which was previously unknown has now revealed itself to the heroic ego. This ego to superego movement, or I, not I, to absolute I movement, is simultaneously the movement to absolute knowing, where the thing in itself, the not I, previously unknown and unknowable to the self, becomes known, and also the unveiling of oneself to the other, and vice versa, like two lovers unclothing to share their most intimate secrets with each other. I know you, and you know me, and this only comes about by encounter and recognition, not the domination and exploitation of putting the other up on the rack of scientific interrogation, as Bacon speculated. This is, as Fichte asserts, the very heart, desire of the ego, to know, to become fused with the other, the not I. That to become one in absolute knowledge. It is a mutual journey. It entails the other to participate as much as it does the self. This I, not I, to absolute I movement is only possible in the phenomenal realm of nature. In Fichte's reimagining, nature is that barrier that separates the I and not I. Nature is the barrier to the noumenal realm that must be slowly broken down and penetrated into through this dialectic of encounter and adventure. As this barrier is broken down, the ego becomes socialized and loving. The I and not I grow closer together and fuse as one, becoming the absolute I over the course of this long process. This is the restoration of the apperceptive unity that was lost in the philosophies of Francis Bacon and René Descartes. Moreover, and in agreement with Kant, the I think, the self, the ego, knows through consciousness. Fichte's epistemology is not only grounded in the self, it is founded upon and in self-consciousness, the logical exhaustion of any epistemology grounded in the self. I come to know through coming to know the other not as simply an object, but as a subject. I can truly come to know its essence, its inner self, itself, because we are now one. This occurs in the mind, the ego, the absolute ego, not as a detached observer, but as an intimate participator. This participation, of course, was through the encounter and recognition of the I and other. If this sounds familiar to Hegel's dialectic of master-slave, of I and other, in the phenomenology of spirit, you would be correct. For Hegel, a contemporary of Fichte, who taught at the same university, was influenced by Fichte, and Hegel subsequently took Fichte's I, not I encounter, the I and other, and historicized it. Fichte's alteration of the Kantian givens of mind and the phenomenal realm of space and time is at once a stronger return to nature than with Kant, but also a stronger sublation of nature through the ego-to-ego encounter en route to the harmonization of the ego-to-ego dialectic of encounter and recognition. Nature, the space existing as a barrier to the free creativity of the ego, must be made or remade in our image. Much like how Freud said, where id is, ego shall be, where nature is, I shall be. Nature, at once, is that which allows for the encounter of the I and not I to move to the absolute I. And nature is that space which allows for the moral community, the ethische Gemeinschaft, to actualize itself, to become manifest in the world. But in this development to moral community, nature is altogether overcome in the realization, the manifestation of moral community. This returns us to Fichte's ethical imperative. If the reductive deterministic materialists are right, there is no moral order. All atoms, particles, in motion, following the laws of motion, do so until they dissipate in atrophy. The unity which is achieved in the movement to absolute I, or absolute ego, is not merely based on the newfound and absolute knowledge we have of each other, but based on the responsibilities and duties we now share to each other. In order to retain this unity, I have responsibilities to you as you have responsibilities to me, because it is through responsibilities to each other that the eternal iteration of the I-you encounter perpetuates itself indefinitely. The I-other becoming I-you, which is really I to myself as two have become one relationship, is the continuous and eternal dialectic of engagement, which self-perpetuates the unity now shared in the absolute I. Again, if Fichte had drawn upon Christian theology more explicitly, he would have had better grounds to defend himself against charges of atheism, charges Fichte disputed and charges his son, a famous Lutheran theologian and philosopher himself, always defended his father from. For if the unity of love which binds the Trinity together ceased, the Trinity would fall apart. In the same manner, the love which now perpetuates and holds the absolute I together must perpetuate itself through the duties and responsibilities we share to one another, otherwise that unity which fused I and not I together would dissipate. All self-consciousness, freedom, and reason is bound together through rational engagement and encounter. We subsequently become accountable to the other because in being accountable to the other, I am also accountable to myself. I have the burden of responsibility to the other, which means I, the ego, have a duty within me to uphold these responsibilities which keep the unity of the moral community tied together. My well-being, as well as the others, depend upon this embrace of duty. To shirk responsibility is to become detached. To embrace responsibility is to become engaged. True freedom, according to Fichte, is the freedom to choose responsibility. It is the freedom to be dutiful and loving to those who constitute the absolute I. Recall back his address to the German nation. The German people, to uphold German unity, have duties and responsibilities to each other. And in total knowledge, I know I have these responsibilities which lead me to action. Responsibility upholds the unity of relations which I have forged through the I, not I, ego to ego movement to absolute I, the moral community manifested on earth through this engagement. Furthermore, the synthesis of egos leads to the moral joy consummated in love. The I replacing God is the Fichtean temporalization of divinization. I embody divinity, and the absolute I is the embodiment of divinity realized as all I's, all egos, all selves are part of the absolute I. The absolute I becomes the Godhead incarnate in the world. The I, not I, have become absolute I in love. Moving on to Friedrich Schelling and his rebuttal and carrying on of the Kantian and Fichtean projects, it is necessary to briefly discuss other influences on Schelling besides Kant and Fichte. Two figures stand in importance to understanding Schelling: Johann von Herder and Johann von Goethe. Herder is important for having recontextualized and published his philosophy of consciousness through the great chain of being. The great chain of being was an ancient Greek to Christian understanding of wholeness in the world. Man, of course, being the most conscious or self-conscious animal, was the closest to God. But everything was all intimately tied and connected to each other on this great ladder ascending from earth to heaven, eternal consciousness and bliss. Some say Herder was a proto-evolutionist. This, in my opinion, is demonstrably false. Herder was inheriting a long tradition of Greco-Christian thought in his formation of the great chain of being leading to man. Man was tied to the rest of the animal kingdom, the vegetative kingdom, and even the material kingdom, because he was lord and steward of all creation. Moreover, man, as a relational animal, means he does not just have relationships with other men, but man has relationships with the world which God has placed him in. Man dwells in the land, the kingdom of matter. That kingdom of matter has in it plants and animals, the kingdoms of vegetables and animals. Thus, in the whole picture, man is tied to the animal, the vegetative, and the material kingdoms, which constitute the earth which man calls home. Truly conscious man, who is connected to the divine source of emanation, is also he who understands this reality and dwells enthusiastically in this world of relationships, which brings about his happiness in life. To shun or break away from these relationships is to reduce man to an atomized particle which ends in misery. More important to Schelling is the famous poet and civil servant Johann von Goethe. Goethe, beyond being a great poet and Weimar servant, was also a sort of proto-scientist, or a lay scientist in his spare time. Goethe established proto-morphological science, that is, plant biology, when he was not writing or working for the Weimar government. Goethean science was equally a rejection of the reductive mechanical view of science that emanated from Francis Bacon and Sir Isaac Newton. According to Goethe, the problem with reductionist science was it lacked totality, it lacked wholeness, it lacked an understanding of science, and especially biology, as a process of becoming. You could not isolate life to a single moment or reduce life to its stripped and bare bones. To do so is to miss the bigger picture, so to speak. To only look at a tree rather than the forest network the tree is attached to is to fundamentally not understand what one is studying. Dig into a forest root system and you suddenly find it to be one giant living organism, something reductionist science cannot do, as it is foundationally isolative and reductionist in spirit. Reducing said tree down to its trunk, its roots, and then to its seed is to ultimately deny the tree, reducing the seed, furthermore, to being a collection of atoms and particles is to equally miss the mark. Goethe's science was one of unitive participation, from seed to roots to sprout to trunk to tree to forest. But this exists for everything else. The bears and deer in the forest depend on all the plants and all the other animals for their livelihood. To destroy one is to condemn all. All life, according to Goethe, participates in this unitive cycle of growth, decline, death, rebirth. Each has particular functions to play in the web of life, and, therefore, Goethe achieves a certain rehabilitation of the vitalistic account of science overthrown by Bacon and the mechanicalist scientists and philosophers. Here enters Friedrich Schelling. While influenced by Kant and Fichte, Schelling deviates from them insofar that he does not start with the mind, or the ego, as Kant and Fichte, but with nature itself, per Goethe. Therefore, Schelling's axiomatic foundation is not the mind, the rational, or the transcendental, but the natural, nature. The mind, for Schelling, is an outgrowth of the forces of conflict within nature and the organic morphological system of science. Schelling's enemies were twofold. While influenced by Fichte, especially in his earlier days before he fully broke with Fichte later in life, Schelling came to conclude that the implications of Fichte's philosophy of the absolute ego and consciousness would still lead us down the path of a dangerous solipsism, the same solipsism that Fichte was criticized for by his contemporaries. At the same time, as was the case with the whole of German idealistic and romantic thought, Schelling was also vehemently opposed to the anti-teleological and reductionist empiricism and materialism of the dominant Anglo-French schools of thought, which eventually produced utilitarianism, with the likes of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Schelling sought to reconcile the philosophy of consciousness and transcendentalism of earlier German philosophers, Kant and Fichte and Herder, with a form of non-reductionist empiricism that was also teleological, thereby allowing humans to have total knowledge through coming to know the end of the purpose of life. The core idea of Schelling's Naturphilosophie is that everything springs from nature. Rejecting the mechanical model of earlier Enlightenment science, Schelling was at the forefront of integrating the new biological and organicist models of science, Goethean science, with philosophy. Thus, rather than the cold, mechanical, and lifeless philosophy and science that dominated the British and French materialist and utilitarian schools of thought, Schelling embraced an organicist, rhizomatic, and even chaotic understanding of the philosophy of science. That is, all life organically grows from an early simplicity to greater levels of complicatedness and intricacy over time, much like how biological and organicist models of science understand life. In this outgrowth becomes more, through time, this outgrowth becomes more and more complex, with more roots, so to speak, taking hold as life expands over time. For Schelling, the high points of life come during the rhizomatic phases, when flourishing is correlated with the creativity of life, of spirit, which in turn is correlated with the uncontrollable nature of rhizomes as they expand rapidly throughout the natural world. Schelling recontextualizes the dialectic of the I, not I, through the morphological realities of biology and also through an ingenious reimagining of space and time from Christian theology. Nature is internally dialectical, one might say paradoxical or even contradictory. There is, on one hand, an infinite expansion of nature, thesis, which is reacted against, the antithesis, by an infinite contraction of the natural. The forces of nature are simultaneously moved to expansion, growth in life, and contraction, decadence and death. This results in a disequilibrium, which sets off a generative teleological evolutionary byproduct leading to the new nature, the new life, the synthesis, which grows out of this generative disequilibrium within the forces of nature itself. The movement to self-consciousness and the realization within the realm of nature is what this disequilibrium is moving toward. The first generative principle of nature is space and time. The expansive and contracting principles then take place in the realm of space and time and recapitulate a new outgrowth, gravity and light, with further smaller recapitulations producing chemistry, electricity, and so on. Gravity is the new outgrowth of space. Light is the new outgrowth of time. Space was the outgrowth of the force of expansion, and time, ultimately, the outgrowth, paradoxically, of the force of contraction. This process of dialectical recapitulation continues to cycle, like in Goethean plant biology, producing newer iterations of the natural. From the gravity and light recapitulation emerges organic bodies, first beginning with plants. Then from organic bodies, recapitulation produces animals, and from animals emerge humans. This generative movement of nature culminates in the creation of the human, which is the first and only life form that becomes aware of these generative processes of expansion and contraction and, as such, becomes self-conscious of his place in the natural realm through the emergence of self-conscious thought and reflection, rooted, ultimately, in the generative germ of natural forces acting against one another. This plays out even in human physiology, the growth, consummation, frailty, and death of the body, libidinal or biological urges, expansion, being curtailed by rational constructs and edifices, which order eros, contraction, which makes ethical life possible, but not at the expense of destroying eros, as in Fichte's thought concerning the emergence of the ego and ethical life and community, ultimately leading to the standard Christian consciousness of love as expansive and life-giving is the notion of the expansive process of nature. Its opposite, the corruption of love, lust, sin, is contractive and therefore life-denying. Nature's generative process of coming to self-consciousness culminates in the human being. Thus, Schelling is, in the most traditional and proper sense and usage of the term, a humanist. Schelling believes the human, among all life forms generated by the natural seed of generative recapitulation, understands itself and is able to understand its place in the world. The human being is therefore set apart from the rest of creation. The human is the exception, hence the human is exceptional. Humans are exceptional because they are the exception in coming to self-consciousness and understanding. No other life form has this ability. Schelling believes that animals feel and have all the basic self-perceptions which allow basic sensational awareness, but animals lack the ability to self-consciously reflect and come to know who they are, where they are, why they exist, etc. And neither can animals come to understand all the generative laws of the natural world which they dwell in. Animals simply have, in Schelling's Christian language, the grace to be what they are and to do what they do. Thus, only in the human, the ultimate coming to understanding is that understanding of the consciousness of love. Love is the prime generative principle. Hate or sin is the contractive principle. This was, for Schelling, the internal mythological truth of the Christian understanding of original sin and divinization. Original sin is that aspect of the human which leads us to do evil, which is the negation of life and therefore a contraction of the generative principle of love and expansion. Divinization is that embodiment of love and the principle of self-giving, which brings two self-contracting forces, dying humans, into propagating further expansion, the generative expansive principle, which leads to the creation of new life. Schelling, also being a theologian, along with being a scientist and philosopher, tied this back to the book of Genesis, in which God implants into creation the generative principles of self-propagation, the commands by God to reproduce after one's own kind, which, after moving from space and time to light and gravity to plants to animals to humans, is the generative law that humans follow but can understand. The arc of the evolution of nature, the morphological impulse of all life, reaches fruition in the human, who is the single life form that fully develops the seed of intelligibility and consciousness to the point of self-reflection and self-understanding, and the coming to understand that generative principle of nature as love. Schelling grounds his philosophy in the natural because love, eros, is the basic creative force of nature. It is the force of spirit. In the larger context of philosophy and the world as it relates to civilization, sterile rationalism, mechanicalism, and reductionist materialism, i.e. the scientific as we tend to think of the term today, is that which threatens to sever the human from the ultimate coming to be. It threatens to sever human consciousness and therefore cut us off from the erotic, which is the first generative principle of natural expansion. It is here that Schelling considered himself to be the true heir of Kant, much like Fichte, who was much afraid of the same encroachments of the scientistic and mathematical, i.e. hollow, worldview of Anglo-French materialism. However, by starting with mind, according to Schelling, Kant started with the teleological end product, and was still, despite his opposition to the monistic materialist reductionists, cut off from the natural, which would not resolve the problem of our alienation and destruction of nature. By beginning with nature itself, and tying the mind, transcendental self-consciousness, to nature, Schelling hoped to show how true self-consciousness, true transcendental idealism, must always remain grounded to nature itself and not separated apart from it, as was the unfortunate and ultimately unintentional cases of Kant and Fichte. Thus, in Schelling, we see the essential biological, morphological, and organic reality of life. Nature embodies two principal forces, hence avoiding reductionist monism, expansion and contraction. The dialectic between expansion and contraction is not an equal dialectic. The disequilibrium of the two is necessary, following Newton's laws of motion, which allows the superiority of the expansive over the contractive to win out in the long run. In theological language, this is the triumph of love over hate, of divinization over sin. The cycles of nature recapitulate this basic dialectic, leading to ever more complex life forms, moving through atoms to plants, to animals, and then to humans. It is in humans, the culmination of nature's movement to self-consciousness, nature's movement to self-knowledge, that there is a mind, the human mind, that is fully capable of conscious self-reflection and an understanding of these morphological laws. The intelligibility of the natural world reaches fruition in the human, and the gift of love in the self-conscious human who, unlike Fichte, does not need to destroy nature to be moral, but needs to embrace their most primal nature, true understanding, to be moral, that is, to embrace love itself. The moral is both an outgrowth of, but still linked to, the natural. It is in the biosphere that the generative principle of life, love, waits to be unleashed. The world of edifice, construction, and industry is really the embodiment of the contractive principle. As it relates to human minds, the truly self-conscious mind is that which exudes the generative principle of morphological growth. The mind that has severed itself from nature, which is therefore severed from true self-consciousness and understanding of the generative, is the contractive germ of morphological decline. This also puts humans in the most precarious position as we control our destiny of generative life or contractive death, where other life forms do not. And this prevents humans from being objectified objects in the world, because humans have the ability to escape the laws of contraction by fully embracing the law of generative life through their free will. Schelling begins with nature and, in a paradoxical sense, ends with nature. Nature's becoming, its movement to totality, similar to Fichte's movement to the absolute I, is the process of the emergence of self-consciousness in humans. Here we see Schelling's debt to Kant and Fichte, but as stated before, Schelling broke with Kant and Fichte because the two began where nature ends, the mind. In starting at the teleological endpoint, Kant and Fichte are unable to truly attain the apperceptive unity cut off by the philosophies of Bacon and Descartes. It is not that the spirit of Kant and Fichte are wrong. One might go as far as even saying that Schelling agrees with a certain amount of the substance of Kant and Fichte too. But as long as neither begin with nature as their axiom, neither can sufficiently establish a philosophy that links the I with the not I, or in the case of Fichte, the emergence of the absolute I entails the end of the not I, which is the natural world, which has been sublated in the movement to absolute ego. Thus, we are still cut off from nature in Fichte's ultimate endpoint. Nature, then, for Schelling, must be tied to nature. For the truly self-conscious mind is that which recognizes its outgrowth from and its roots in the natural. Those minds who cut themselves off from this reality are not self-conscious. Indeed, they are the human embodiment of the force of contraction. Those who entrench themselves, so to speak, and reflect back and recognize their deep roots, their Bodenständigkeit, with the biological organism that they dwell in, are those truly self-conscious and knowledgeable minds who possess true knowledge and understanding. This is how Schelling achieves that apperceptive unity that is the primary concern of his predecessors, Kant and Fichte. The unity of knowledge and understanding, the unity of self and world, comes from our unity with nature because we are outgrowths of nature. Knowing this allows us to form the moral community with responsibilities and duties to each other, which permits humans to dwell in the world with both knowledge and the joy that comes with knowledge and active participation in life and love.